Colleagues, good morning. Bonjour tout le monde. I'd like to call this meeting to order and start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Welcome to meeting 6 of the Standing Committee on Natural Resources. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format. We have some witnesses on the line that we'll get to shortly, but this is pursuant to the standing orders. As you know, members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Before we continue, I would ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines written on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including our amazing interpreters, who we thank for doing such good work for us today. You will also notice a QR code on the card, which links to a short awareness video. I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best as we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Speaking of clerks, our regular clerk, Geneviève, is not with us today. We have the very able Cedric Taquet, who is filling in today, and thank you for joining us. Thank you for our lone analyst today. So we're reduced in rank today, but not in quality at all. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted Thursday, September 18, 2025, the committee will resume its study of the development of critical minerals in Canada. Before we start, I would like to tell members that the clerk has had a hard time booking witnesses, even if invitations were sent early and follow-ups were made. For this reason, we only have 3 witnesses for the full 2 hours. And colleagues, I'm going to suggest taking a break around 10 to 5 to. We have, as you know, the back of the room, lunch is here for members. So for this reason, we have only 3 witnesses for the full 2 hours. If members agree, the clerk would like to add more meetings so that 36 witnesses appear. The motion says no less than 6 meetings, which is comprised of 12 panels of 3 witnesses each, which makes 36 witnesses. And just to get a sense from colleagues that is in keeping with your wishes. I do not see any objection. So, yep, go ahead, Mr. Tucker.
No, I wouldn't want to extend the length of this just yet. I don't. We've had lots of times to find witnesses. This is an important study, and I think what we have already for witnesses, we can craft a pretty good report as is. And there's other important studies that I think that we would like to get into the block study here shortly, and prolonging this. If there is a compromise, I'd like us to consider maybe even starting the next study as we wait for the remaining witnesses to come on board versus having additional meetings that are, 3 witnesses for 2 hours. We'll be here all day and all of session without getting this report done. Be our fear.
Thank you, Mr. Tucker, for that comment. Why don't I take that under advisement? We will, regardless, adhere to the spirit of the motion that we all passed, which was no less than six meetings. The clerk, I know, has been working very, very hard and will continue to do so. But Monsieur Simard?
Faut peut-être calculer.
Maybe we should consider. Maybe we should consider. Can you hear the interpretation? Is the interpretation working?
Than we are used to. Here we go. Mr. Rowe, are you okay?
Can you hear the interpretation? No? Do you have the interpretation? This is the interpreter speaking. Does it work? Okay. So, at first glance, I'm not against the idea of having more meetings to hear all of the witnesses, but we have to take into consideration that we have to travel. And in that context, we will also be hearing witnesses that may be on the list. So before setting up new witnesses, I would like to calculate the number of witnesses we will meet when we go to Saguenay and Sudbury. And perhaps in that way, we would have a complete picture sufficient to create a report.
Anyone else on this issue? Ron or Mr. McKinnon?
Yeah, I understand where Mr. Tucker is getting at. We want to get to these other studies. There is nothing to stop us from starting a new study before we complete this one. I think one of the problems with the first study in a new parliament, for example, is the shortness of time to arrange for witnesses. So I certainly appreciate that we have a certain amount of flexibility. We want to do the travel and we want to do all that stuff. But I think we can be flexible, and I think we can get everybody's witnesses in as we need to.
So, colleagues, why don't you leave it with me? There may be some options of adding an additional witness for each meeting to get to that 36 total, or as Mr. Tucker has suggested, that we start one study and we can have a dedicated meeting after we start that study. But so if colleagues are agreeable, leave this with me. We do have when we come back full panels for the next 2 sessions. And maybe we can add to those panels and beef up our witness list and get done in the time table that we originally set. So, everyone okay with that, Mr. Tucker? You okay with that? Yeah. Great. But thanks for that intervention. And having a little trouble with the new system here, but I'd now like to welcome our witnesses for the first panel. Our witness, rather. On Zoom, we have Sheldon Watney, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Saskatchewan First Nations Natural Resources Centre of Excellence. And members, you will see that there's very much a First Nations theme today. Mr. Watney, you will have 5 minutes or less for your opening remarks, and you have the floor.
Good morning to everybody in attendance today. It's a real pleasure to be able to share some commentary and appear before you in respect to the future of Canada, really, and relative to First Nations assertion of rights and jurisdiction is always at the forefront of the work that we do here at the Centre. And we're an organization that is wholly owned by 74 First Nations across Saskatchewan, also 6 treaty territories that underlie the province of Saskatchewan here. I'm speaking to you from Treaty 6 territory, and in terms of a submission that I forwarded yesterday. It's very important, I think, as we move through the session today, to understand that, we're at a critical point, in Canada with respect to First Nations relationships. I think it's very important to understand as well that from a First Nations perspective that, we are spiritually and intrinsically tied to our lands and territories here across Saskatchewan. And from the perspective of my work and our work here at the center, we have a board of chiefs that are appointed from each of the tribal councils across Saskatchewan and a representative of the 74 First Nations. And when we look at, the historical relationship with Canada and First Nations, or the Crown and First Nations more respectively, and we look at the consideration of inherent rights as that relates to treaty rights, as that relates to Section 35 in the Constitution. And we're on a journey here in Canada to determine what the best path forward is in respect to natural resource development in terms of critical minerals and the global demands and domestic demands now for critical minerals. And when it comes to the opportunities ahead of us, I think Canada has a profound opportunity to recognize First Nations, not as participants, not as shareholders, but as rightful partners and rights holders. But also with the great work that's being done across Saskatchewan by our First Nations in establishing local governance systems, in establishing economic development corporations. They've had the foresight as well to consider how do we become involved in shaping the country's resource and economic future. And I think that as we do move forward through our conversation today, I'll be able to share a bit more, with respect to inherent and treaty rights, but also in terms of some of the work that has been done and is ongoing in terms of trade and diplomacy right across North America. And, we have First Nations that have high aspirations when it comes to development of lands and resources as well. Of course, we want to ensure that our lands and territories and our waters are protected for future generations and with respect to traditional and cultural ways of life. But we also recognize the great opportunities before us in terms of equity opportunities within some of the major projects, within supply chain and procurement, and also workforce development. But the question is, how do we meaningfully participate as First Nations within these sectors, that being the critical mineral sector and of course, the energy sector with respect to new nuclear. And these are very important components of the work that we do here at the center, and I'll be very happy to share more throughout the morning. And, I think that one of the key points that, we are taught from our elders and past leadership. I've had the opportunity to serve as chief of my First Nation back from 2006 to 2010, Red Pheasant Cree Nation. And one of the aspects and teachings that has been passed down is that through treaty, we didn't cede or surrender our resources here within our treaty lands. And so as we look at opportunities that lie in front of us, those notions of resource revenue sharing, of royalty sharing, these are all concepts and components that we discuss quite a bit at our meetings and our interactions with our First Nations leadership. And to my earlier point, I think that with some of the opportunities that we have domestically and globally, there is some great opportunity that Canada has today to reshape the future in terms of positive capacity building, collaborative relationships with First Nations individually and collectively. And so I'll leave my comments there for now. I'll certainly share much more throughout the morning, but it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, the questions, conversation as we move forward through the morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Watney, and I know Members around the table will have some questions for you, and we'll start with Mr. Tucker.
Yes, Mr. Whitney, thank you for appearing virtually at the committee today, and more importantly, thank you for being a leader back in our home province of Saskatchewan. Could you give the committee more insight on uranium's importance as a critical mineral?
I think, you know, in terms of uranium, obviously there's been a lot of interaction and work that's been done in the north with respect to Cameco, Orano, and now NextGen with the Rook I. Obviously, in relation to supply chain, in relation to workforce opportunities in the north, those relationships have developed over the course of a number of years, which has provided some positive outcomes for nations and individuals in the north. And I think one of the things that we're keeping our eyes on as First Nations more collectively across the province is when it comes to the potential deployment of small modular reactors, micro reactors, as we move forward in the energy transition, if you will, we gain a greater understanding of the importance of uranium and the fuel enrichment that occurs, elsewhere and finds its way back here to fuel those types of reactors. And so, as First Nations in Saskatchewan, with our organization here, alongside our leadership and our technicians, now the path forward is to ensure that we're bringing on the adequate capacity to fully understand and make fully informed decisions when it comes to small modular reactor deployment here in the province. And as is anywhere, I think across the globe, there's mixed reactions when it comes to nuclear based on historical experience and past experiences or understandings. And so some of that role and responsibility that we have here at the center, and myself, I'll speak for myself specifically, is that we take on that role to help educate and build capacity for our First Nations leadership and our First Nations communities. So with respect to that, in terms of uranium,
the SMRs and power generation later rounds, but I'm really interested for you to share with the committee members to know what Cameco has been such a success in our province in economic reconciliation, and it is the largest private sector employer of Indigenous people in Canada. But could you explain to the committee a little bit more on how they've been so successful, and maybe also branch into what NextGen and Rook I would mean and how big of a project that is? And it seems to be a little bit stalled in the red tape, and maybe a little bit of comment on that journey, if you can, and then we'll get into power generation later on.
Yeah, I think, obviously, just to your point, Cameco has done a lot of work in the north, and, as I'd mentioned, they have been a big benefit to many of the nations. I will say that in some of my travels to the north, though, that, I think that the workforce development, as we look at, from a post-secondary perspective, there are opportunities there. I think what is missing, and I've shared this in many of my conversations with folks from Cameco and First Nations in the north, that there needs to be increased investment in on-reserve education. And so if we want to drill down to some of those concepts that we speak about, in my experience, I think we're going to be in real trouble over the next 10 to 20 years with respect to a labor force, with respect to workforce development as it relates to uranium, as it relates to other critical minerals, because there's such a high competition for tradespeople and others of the like. And so when we're looking at those opportunities of temporary foreign workers and those types of things, that all plays into this conversation. So while there has been, positive strides that have had great impact in the north, I think when we're looking at the future, there's a great deal of work that needs to be done in understanding the lack of opportunity for First Nations youth on reserve.
Yeah, that is so crucial, is to get either both STEM and increased support for SIIT in our province. And it's the shortages that are coming, that is the opportunity now is to move on it. You brought up temporary foreign workers, and we've made a stance that we would like that program wound down. Would you support that position then, so that we give opportunities for Canadians and Indigenous people?
You know, what I would support is definitely is increased investment in on-reserve education to build up our youth. And I in my travels and in my experiences, I haven't heard of any solid plan or come across any solid plan where, let's say, industry or respective levels of government have taken a keen focus or a specific focus on how we're going to alleviate that strains in terms of lack of educational resources on reserve.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Tucker and Mr. Watney. We're going to move on to MP McKinnon and then Monsieur Simard. Mr. McKinnon.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mr. Watney, for being here and for participating in our study.
Thank you.
As you obviously know, and as we are learning, the importance of consultation with Indigenous groups is growing over the years, and it's still far below what it probably needs to be. Wonder if you could advise us what we need to do it better to make sure that Indigenous groups are properly consulted and properly able to participate in the various programs that we are considering.
Awesome. I think number one, early meaningful engagement is a term that we utilize quite often. And it's so important because oftentimes what happens is that the engagement or consultation occurs after there's much deliberation and planning, on behalf of the proponent and on behalf of the respective levels of government, that being the province, potentially municipality, and also the federal government. And so we come in a bit late, and obviously that relationship starts off on the wrong foot. And I think another important point is there needs to be appropriate capacity and funding provided to First Nations to meaningfully understand what a project is and how it can potentially impact our rights, that being inherent rights and that being treaty rights as well. And so when you think about it as a First Nations leader, as a chief counsel, technician on a First Nation, leadership is dealing with many different things during a day or a week or a month. And so when we're looking at projects, major projects that may impact lands or territories, nations don't often have the capacity to be able to respond to duty to consult trigger letters, to better understand from a scientific or technical perspective what the project is, how it's going to impact. And so, for our situation here in Saskatchewan, that's precisely why we developed and implemented the Center of Excellence that I run, to be able to be there as a capacity organization for First Nations. So when it comes to aspects of consultation, I think it's extremely important that we don't leave out accommodation as well and what that means to the nation. I think if we dig deeper, I firmly believe in many of our discussions that we've had with elders and leadership over a number of years, that the consultation mechanisms need to be developed by the First Nations themselves. And when it's an imposed consultative process, whether it's the province, whether it's the federal government, again, it becomes very problematic because our interpretation of rights may differ and vary from the interpretation of those interpretations of the respective levels of government as well, it being the RM, province, and federal government again. And so consultation is an extremely important component when it comes to the development of critical minerals, when it comes to the development of major projects. And we cannot all see the future, but we need to prepare the best that we can. And, you know, I'm sure it's been heard many times by many of the members around the table that First Nations are here to stay. You know, we have reserves. These are our treaty and traditional territories, and we're not going anywhere. And so as we look at consultation and further down the road to accommodation, what does the journey look like in between? And because we need to balance economic benefits, socioeconomic benefits of a potential project, but also balance that against what are the potential adverse impacts that these projects may have to lands and waters, but also the impacts to practicing our inherent and treaty rights as First Nations people. And again, those understandings and interpretations may differ from those perspectives of the provincial and federal governments.
So I'm going to cut you off right there a little bit. I have a minute left. So I wanted to drill down a little bit into your observation that we need to have more investment into on-reserve education. Are we talking about better primary education, better high school? Are we looking at technical levels? And once that is done, do you think that will help to inform the population regarding potential developments and how to interpret them?
A short answer,
Yes.
Mr. Butney.
Yes, I agree. I think we need investments in teachers. I think we need investment in broadband, investment in technical resources. You know, there's great advancements being made globally, but again, the formal, specific investment in on-reserve First Nations education is crucial to the future of the country.
Thank you. We'll now move to Monsieur Simard for 6 minutes. 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just want to make sure, Mr. Whitney, that you can hear me well. Is the interpretation working for you? Can you hear the interpretation? Can you hear what I'm saying, Mr. Simard is asking? Can you hear the interpreter?
I just put on my interpretation to English. My apologies.
Great.
Okay. So thank you very much, Mr. Whitney, for your presentation. So I found it interesting that you were talking about consultations. I understand that for the First Nations, as is the case for us also, there is technical information on some projects is not always accessible and easy to understand for neophytes, for people who don't really know the mining sector in detail. Do you believe that for First Nations, there's sufficient transparency before carrying out large-scale projects which will have effects on the territory, on the land, on the health of communities, also on the environment of the communities? Do you think there's sufficient transparency on the part of the federal government in that sense?
In my experience, I would say no. There isn't sufficient information or forwarded, to First Nations. And so, back to my earlier point, I think many of our nations are caught off guard in many respects. Depending on which level of government that the consultative process is entered into, if you will. There are deadlines in terms of First Nations responses to a project or aspects of a project. And so that becomes extremely problematic due to your point. Perhaps the lack of information that's forwarded, fulsome information, and then from a leadership perspective, you need to fully understand it to make well-informed decisions. Those those lead to aspects of FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, as it relates to a project, if we're speaking from an UNDRIP perspective. But then we're also looking at inherent in treaty rights and cultural perspective as well. So when you look at a leadership of a First Nation, they have their own consultation to do as well with their respective members, the elders, the youth, other leadership around the leadership table, and band membership, because these projects, they can benefit, but they can also have adverse impacts once again that we're left with. So my short answer would be no, and I guess that provides an opportunity to increase that level of capacity for First Nations for understanding.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I don't want to unduly blame the federal government, because I understand that the government's orientation is to want to involve First Nations in a more intensive way than in the past. But I know, however, that nothing is ever perfect. And in your presentation, you talked about mechanisms of consultations that would be created by and for the First Nations. That intrigued me. Are there models, are there examples where this type of mechanism of consultation was implemented? Has there been a formal recognition? I understand that for you, you're in Saskatchewan, but in terms of the provincial government, the federal government, has there been recognition of this type of consultation?
I would say aspects of it, but from my knowledge, there hasn't been a formal recognition of a First Nations led consultation process. In looking back in some of the work that we've done over the years, we've actually taken the liberty to develop consultation, policy templates for First Nations to utilize. But the experience that we have had, I would say, is that the consultation duty to consult policy framework has largely been developed without, meaningful First Nations involvement, which has, of course, created some problematic issues, which have led to, in many cases, First Nations not supporting projects. But I think as we start to better understand each other, what those demands are globally, and really creating frameworks around meaningful involvement for First Nations, that being from a consultative perspective, but also from, again, back to our economic and socioeconomic opportunities. I think the relationships are getting better and the understanding is increasing, but we still do have a long way to go.
Merci. Je vois qu'il me reste simplement une minute.
Thank you. I see that I only have 1 minute more, Mr. Watney, so I'll come back to the same question later. I just wanted to tell you that maybe if we have time later, I will like you to talk about your vision of First Nations as a partner, as a full participant of certain large mining projects. I hear more and more people from the mining sector tell us that they want to have First Nations be there in an equitable way. So I know we won't have time, but if you have any information about it in the next round of questions, I'll come back to the topic.
We'll come back to, Monsieur Simard will come back to you on that in another round. So, colleagues, we've finished our first round. We're on to our second round. We'll start with Mr. Mallette, then Mr. Gay, Monsieur Simard, Monsieur Martel, and then Monsieur Hogan. And we'll see where we are then, and we may have to move on to the next panel. But Mr. Mallette.
Thank you.
For 5 minutes.
Mr. Watani, going to your life experience and your path, what lessons can be applied to reduce project delays while ensuring meaningful Indigenous equity and monitoring. What could you tell us through your experience?
You know, I'll be really quick with the first part, but I think, you know, we go back to ensuring that the First Nations, you know, whether they're determined to be impacted by the federal or provincial government, or whether they're determined to be impacted by the nations themselves, need adequate capacity to understand projects. That being not only the environmental, cultural, traditional way of life impacts, but also those opportunities that rest in terms of equity, supply chain, and workforce development. If we're starting to look at it from a whole, you know, a holistic notion in terms of a file on a project, you know, to your point, opportunities for equity is an increasingly important aspect of our involvement. I can't stress that enough. Of course, we've seen some of the loan guarantee programs come into effect, but there's also a perspective that our equity is already being put forward with the land and the resources. And so when we're tasked with going out to borrow additional equity to participate as partners in a project, that's a concern and an issue in itself. And so as we look at these opportunities that arise in the race for critical minerals across the globe, how do we best participate? And you know, I would say unequivocally those opportunities for equity participation are important, but we also recognize that we have a nation-to-nation relationship as First Nation governments with the Government of Canada, and we also have, a First Nation relationship with the respective provinces across Canada as well. And when it comes to resource revenue sharing or royalty sharing, those are increasingly important aspects that need to be considered by the respective governments, because when projects do move from past the red tape, as was mentioned earlier, into operations, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that to date we don't see much of as First Nations. And so I think that's an important component to be mindful of in terms of your future deliberations within your respective level of government.
Thank you. Again, has the Government of Canada taken sufficient steps to move beyond consultation and effectively engage with First Nations to ensure they have a meaningful voice and genuine autonomy in project negotiations under the Impact Assessment Act?
You know, when I think back to some of the work that we've done over the past handful of years, I mean, there's been definitely some positive strides. Does it go far enough? In my experience, I think that First Nations need more of a, how would I say, need a increasingly developed process to ensure that there is consistent oversight when it comes to a project, and that when advice is provided or rights assertions are provided, that we have a clear understanding on how that's received, and how that information finds its way, in terms of the overall future of a given project. Because many times we discuss as First Nations, we discuss with, whether it's the Impact Assessment Agency, whether it's the Canadian Energy Regulator, but once we've shared what our concerns are, potential impacts, we don't necessarily understand where that information goes, how it's deliberated, and how decisions are made based on the assertions of First Nations.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you to you both. And Monsieur Gay, allez-y.
Thank you, Mr. Whitney, for participating today. It's much appreciated. And I'm going to have a couple of questions for you because I truly appreciate the Center of Excellence model that you've created for Saskatchewan First Nation. And I think we owe it to learn lessons from you and the First Nations that you represent. You mentioned equity, you mentioned royalties. The Ministry of Natural Resources, the Office of Major Project would be more, and the government would be more than interested in your thoughts. We've announced a loan guarantee program. We actually increased it from $5 billion to $10 billion. So we're making a massive investment from that side. But I understand from you there are many other considerations in creating agreements with the First Nation. So I would be interested from you, maybe you can talk a little bit today, but I would also be interested if you could submit to the committee as part of our study templates of what it should look like. And I'm not asking for a certain percentage, but I'm asking for something a sketch that we could start that actually covers all the elements that should be part. So can we leverage that fund? What else should we consider? And what would be a good template?
Awesome. Well, I've given lots of thought to this for many, many years. But I know that we only have so much time today, but I'll be happy to follow up and share more after today. In Saskatchewan, we've gotten really good at building institutions that serve the collective, and the collective being the 74 First Nations in Saskatchewan. And I know that referenced earlier this morning by Mr. Tucker. Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technologies is a sister organization to us here at the Center of Excellence, and our mandate is to serve our First Nations. We also have another organization entity called the Saskatchewan Indian Gaming Authority, where First Nations have come together to wholly own 7 casinos here in Saskatchewan. And with respect to benefits and dividends associated with our gaming and casinos, we have developed what we call a First Nations Trust among the First Nations in Saskatchewan, and that consists of all 74 First Nations. And so 50% of the net revenues from our gaming, from the Saskatchewan Indian Gaming Authority, are dispersed on a quarterly basis to each First Nation on a per capita basis. And so when we look at some of these major projects, whether it be critical minerals projects, whether it be energy projects, that model is definitely an ongoing consideration on how we come together relative to opportunities in the future. And so, as goes with the consultative process, there are communities in the vicinity of the project that, are impacted to a greater level than perhaps those that are further away. But some of the conversations that we've been having are, what opportunities do those impacted nations in the vicinity of the project require? What are their aspirations? But then what are those, for the sake of today, tier 2 opportunities associated with the collective? And I think that brings not only the opportunity for a broader consultative process, but I think it also brings forward the opportunity for First Nations to come together from the aspect of an equity framework. and what are collective First Nations looking forward to potentially investing in any given project. And so those are some of the equity frameworks that we're working through now in respect to some of these major projects, and namely some of the opportunities in nuclear moving forward.
Okay.
So
Thank you, Mr. Gay. Thank you, Mr. Whitney. We are on to Monsieur Simard for 2.5 minutes, Mr. Rowe for 5, MP Hogan for 5.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. So, Mr. Whitney, I would like to come back to what we were talking about earlier. I was asking you how the First Nations could be partners, could be stakeholders. And I find that interesting where you're talking about revenue in trust that your association has. So it lets us see that First Nations can also be economic actors, can be investors in these projects. I'd like to hear from you how that can be done from your side. If you have any examples where First Nations have already been involved with equity in mining projects, I'd like you to talk about that.
Some of the opportunities that our nations have been involved in or currently negotiating are from a royalty share perspective in the province. I think that moving forward, those aspirations are there in terms of First Nations, whether it's individually or collectively coming together to invest in a project as an equity partner. And so further to your question and further to my earlier point, we look at those initiatives being separate. There's a relationship, a nation to nation relationship based on inherent and treaty rights with the Crown. But then we also look at a separate relationship with a potential proponent of a mining project, of a nuclear project, or whatever the case may be. And so as we look at those opportunities from an economic standpoint, taking advantage of loan guarantee mechanisms. I'm also a board member of the Saskatchewan Indigenous Investment and Finance Corporation. So there are those opportunities that have come forward in renewable energy projects, in potentially in the SMR deployment here in Saskatchewan. Those conversations are occurring, not necessarily in the mining sector to date, but those certainly are opportunities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. Mr. Rowe, 5 minutes. Mr. Hogan, 5 minutes, and then we will take a break to change panels.
Well, thank you for having me here today. Mr. Whitney, I have a question about the, it's clear that you see the importance of industrial mining and development across the country. And you mentioned how you're fighting for Indigenous groups not only engage and participate in this development, but also own equity and have leadership in these developments. And you mentioned how it's important to protect lands and waters while at the same time having responsible development. So considering the Liberal government recently, through the signing of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, has a plan to prohibit 30% of Canada's lands and waters from development by 2030 and 50% of Canada's lands and waters by 2050. Do you think that prohibiting the development to half of your lands would have a huge negative effect on Indigenous communities, especially those that rely heavily on natural resource and mining sectors?
Well, I think that, coming back to our role here at the center, in terms of impacts and those types of notions, that's the importance of the consultative process. And each of the nations, that are interacted with, that are consulted, will have differing opinions. But I do think that, from a personal perspective, that we need to ensure that, for the future, for our kids, that there are opportunities to practice our cultural and traditional way of life in a clean way. We need to ensure that we are afforded that ability to carry out our inherent and treaty rights, not only hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering, but others that, you know, people in nations see as their respective rights.
Yeah, and I would agree that I would even say that you guys have a right to develop your resources if you wanted to. And we have this issue in offshore Newfoundland where companies will not invest in exploration because the federal government deemed that, because at any point the federal government could deem that area a marine protected area. So if you have billions of dollars invested in exploration, you still may have to bugger off regardless of how much you invested because that's a marine protected area. And I'm just wondering, do you think these extremes are really needed? Like, would you agree that our current environmental standards already protect our waters and environment at a reasonable level?
In my experience, I don't think they do. I think that much more needs to be done. And I think it's, again, you know, I'll come back to my earlier point. It's relative to the capacity, understanding, and conveyance of each of the respective nations on what they see as impacts to their waters, to their lands and territories. You know, being from the prairies and here in Treaty 6, difficult for me to speak on behalf of those on the eastern seaboard. But from our perspective here on the prairies, I mean, our cultural way of life is paramount to our future. And it's difficult to you know, trade that for development as we move forward. So there's a lot of conversations that definitely need to occur to ensure that our people can continue on with a strong identity into the future.
Yeah, and you know, as a Newfoundlander, we understand the frustration of having our you know, fisheries oftentimes controlled by federal governments, and we want to have more control at a local level. So I completely understand where you're coming from. And what I find interesting is the feds just brought in C5, which basically controls where they can have a project at any time, and kind of streamline through regardless of other inputs. They have that right to do that now, and at the same time, they're bringing in this 50 by 50 mandate, which determines areas that they don't want development at pretty well without a lot of discussion. So I'm just thinking, do you think that with the combination of C5 dictating where things should happen and can't happen, and 50-50 mandate of things where they can't happen, do you think that gives too much control to the federal government and goes against all the work that Indigenous communities did to finally get a seat at the table?
I think at the outset, there's definitely a lot of concerns in our conversations around our table. And just further to my written piece, I think that written submission, you know, I stated in there that, you know, when it comes to the implementation of an act like that could be received as, you know, less consultation, less accommodation, potential erosion of the opportunities to practice our inherent and treaty rights, it comes with a lot of trauma from the past. And so, you know, understanding that the Major Projects Office has been implemented, but when you look at a Saskatchewan perspective, we have the Center of Excellence, which is essentially our Major Projects Office for First Nations. And so that's what we're built for. And I think that's
Okay.
We need to play a lead role in that light.
Thank you both. And wrapping up this round, MP Hogan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Whitney, thank you for being here. You said something that really caught my attention and I thought brilliantly summarized the central question in front of us in your opening statement. You said that the question is, how do First Nations meaningfully participate as First Nations in critical mineral and energy sector? And so to that point, what supports, you know, capacity building, legal, negotiation funding do First Nations need from the federal government to participate more fully as partners rather than as passive stakeholders?
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. I couldn't have asked for a better question. But, you know, I think that, you know, when we look across the board, we look at, you know, potential impacts to rights, accommodations, offsets. We look at opportunities for equity. You know, I think from our perspective here at the center, we need to ensure that First Nations, respectively, as autonomous nations, have capacity in their band office, in-house, on reserve. But we also need that support for regional central organizations like the Center of Excellence that works on behalf of First Nations and is there to assist and support nations as well. I think ongoing sustainable core funding for organizations like ours will definitely assist in the facilitation, the knowledge sharing, the education and capacity building of our First Nations. We work on behalf of them. We play that role as an interface between government and industry and First Nations. So it's a very important, components of the work that we do. We're building out a major projects tracker that relates to, impact assessments, consultation, project tracking, all those types of things. We're also building out, and have built out for that matter, recruitment portal and framework for Indigenous people and Indigenous businesses in Saskatchewan, so that once projects are moving forward, that we're helping along with the recruitment of our people and bringing forward our businesses as vendors on our own 2 feet as First Nations in Saskatchewan. And I think that's very important from a local perspective.
Okay, thank you. I'm really encouraging you to provide additional written comments on the equity components, like Monsieur Simard was mentioning. It's a really interesting topic, but knowing that we are very short with time, I just want to ask, is there anything else you want to add you didn't have the opportunity to say in your responses so far?
I appreciate all the questions, that we've gone through this morning. But I strongly feel that, in relation to the future that, respective governments have a really important role to play in advancing economic reconciliation with us as First Nations. We've been through TRC, we're moving through RIP. I can't stress enough that First Nations, we need capacity support on the ground to better understand these projects. Will a major projects office do that? I'm not fully confident in that. I think that we've been built here in Saskatchewan to work on behalf and serve our First Nations, and we do that well. But the increased capacity from our perspective is also important because of the enormous momentum, right across the globe with respect to critical minerals and energy. And working for 74 First Nations, the work can be extremely daunting. But the final point I'll leave is that, the Center of Excellence that we built here, it's the only one of its kind in Canada, where all of us as First Nations are working collectively and have an organization that fully serves our First Nations across Saskatchewan. And I think, as we move forward, just to my last point, when we look at the historical relationship and we look forward to the responsibility to one another, we are here to work in partnership and collaboration. We just need to ensure that we're able to make well-informed decisions to do that effectively and increase the benefit for our First Nations on and off reserve.
Okay. Good place to end. Thank you, Mr. Hogan, and a big thank you to you, Mr. Watney. You got the full treatment today as our only witness, and really rich discussion with our members. And thank you so much for being a witness, for presenting us today. And as Mr. Hogan suggested, anything you want to supply in written form is welcome by the committee and will be looked at by our analysts and by us. So thank you so much. I understand that you will be just staying on the screen for the next hour just to hear the next witness, just to let our colleagues know, and I have granted that wish. So colleagues, we're going to take a break now to change panels, and we'll be back in 7 to 10 minutes.
Thank you. Have a great day.
where are we?
Here, you would like to welcome back.
Yes, colleagues, welcome back. And for those on Zoom, I'm sorry I have to repeat myself, but at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either floor, English, or French. And for those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. I would now like to welcome our witnesses for the second panel. And colleagues, as discussed at the break, Mr. Whitney has remained online for us and is open to questions, but our single witnesses today are, I will announce shortly, oh yes, Charlene Gale, Chair of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, and Sean Fantozo, Vice President of Policy for the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. Ms. Gale, you will have 5 minutes or less for your opening remarks, and I know members around the table are very anxious to ask questions and engage in dialogue with you. So please proceed.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Charlene Gale. I'm a member of the Fort Nelson First Nation, which is on the northeast corner of British Columbia, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Chair of the First Nation Major Projects Coalition. I'm appearing today with FNMPC's Vice President of Policy, Sean Fantazo. FNMPC is a nonprofit organization representing more than 180 First Nation members across 10 provinces and 2 territories. Its mandate is to advance the economic and environmental interests of its members. The energy transition is reshaping the global economy. Electric vehicles, batteries, renewable power, all depends on reliable supplies of critical minerals. The International Energy Agency projects that global demand for nickel, cobalt, and lithium will quintuple by 2040. Canada has what the world needs. Our resources are valued at more than $350 billion, and most are within Indigenous territories. Developing them responsibly is a matter of jurisdiction, partnership, and shared prosperity. If we get this right, critical minerals can be a part of a new era of economic reconciliation in which First Nations are owners, project proponents, business leaders, decision makers in how minerals are developed and recycled. In 2022 and 2023, First Nations convened its members, government officials, and industry representatives in a series of roundtables focused on critical minerals. 3 themes emerged from those discussions. First, free, prior, informed consent must guide every decision. Consent is not just a checkbox exercise. It requires trust and accountability, and it must be nurtured. Projects built with consent are more likely to succeed and endure. Second, without capacity, there will be no consent. Many First Nations are being approached by mining companies from around the world and often without much notice and with limited information. Access to relevant legal, financial, technical, and environmental expertise is imperative. And so, too, is having the resources to engage members and ensure that decisions reflect community preferences, not just the advice of outside consultants. Third, the opportunity for participating economically in the entire critical mineral value chain must be explored. Economic participation in mining sector remains concentrated in exploration, contracting, construction services, with very limited involvement in the downstream value chain. Far beyond exploration and extraction, there are opportunities in refining, processing, manufacturing, recycling, and supporting infrastructure such as transmission lines, roads, and ports. First Nation participation will help strengthen domestic supply chains and keep more value here in Canada. In partnership with the Transition Accelerator, FNMP is setting the full value chain of Canada's critical mineral sector. We're planning to release our findings in early 2026 in advance of our 9th annual conference in Toronto. We're already seeing First Nations leading in the critical mineral sector, from Norway House Cree Nation purchasing the Minago Nickel project in Manitoba, to Niska Nation and Tahltan Nation announcing to a joint venture at the Port of Stewart to export critical minerals from British Columbia, Coast to Selkirk First Nation, acquiring the rights for Minto Copper Gold Mine in the Yukon, with plans to redevelop the site according to its traditional laws. Long before European contact, First Nations harvested and traded minerals as part of their sophisticated traditional economies. The Tlingit, for an instance, has long created shield-shaped coppers, a symbol of wealth and identity that speaks to an endearing relationship with the land. Yet, in the modern era, the benefits of mining have too often bypassed our communities. Many First Nations have negotiated meaningful partnerships in the last 25 years, and more than 500 impact benefit agreements have been signed between First Nations and mining companies. But many more have also endured environmental damage, social disruption, and little to no lasting benefits. That imbalance must not be repeated in the critical mineral sector. Canada's critical minerals opportunity is nation building in scale for the country and for First Nations, and it must be rooted in economic partnership. Since most deposits are in Indigenous territories, development must proceed with free, prior, and informed consent every step of the way. Persistent barriers include capacity gaps, outdated free entry systems that violate the Crown's duty to consult, and limited access to capital tailored to the risk profile of critical mineral sector. We also need to do a better job at prioritizing early engagement as an investment in the trust required to deliver durable, defensible project outcomes. I want to reiterate the importance of the recommendations from the committee's 2021 report on critical minerals, which called for meaningful consultation and partnerships with Indigenous communities, investment in training and capacity development, and support for value-added processing within Canada. The report recognized that our country's advantage in critical minerals depends upon more than its natural resource endowment. It requires extensive, inclusive government, reliable infrastructure, meaningful Indigenous participation across the entire value chain. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, FNMP stands ready to support you and Canada to help ensure that the development of critical minerals is more than about extraction. It can be about building a future where Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities prosper together, where Indigenous rights are respected, and where Canada outcompetes on a global scale in a manner that protects our national security. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Gale. And for our first round of questioning, first round of questioning, we have MP Tucker, MP Gay, and MP Simard, each for 6 minutes. Mr. Tucker.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for our witness for being here today, and more importantly, thank you for what the First Nations Major Projects Coalition potentially could do for our country. It's what's been missing. Very grateful for some of the lessons and points that you made during your presentation. If we're going to succeed, we need to learn on other past successful projects that you guys have been associated with. And I understand that one of your projects in the past was a 10% equity option in the Coastal GasLink in 2019. And that was a successful project. But what have you learned from that project that we can use on the critical minerals expansion in Canada?
I'd like to thank you for your question. I think what we really learned is how powerful it is when First Nations come to work together in defining their own destiny. The coalition was formed by hereditary and elected leaders. And what happened is they actually had an opportunity to have ownership in the Pacific Trails pipeline. But when they went for financing, it was at credit card rates. And so the elected leadership and hereditary chiefs knew they needed to do something. And so they really pushed for the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. I think that, the program is great, but there is more need for more money based on the scale of projects that need to be built. There was a lot of roundtables, and one of the other things that I think that was really helpful in the project that came from those roundtables is the need for capacity, the need to have funds to develop our education system so that we have the workforce, with First Nations being the biggest growing population in Canada. But also with these kind of projects, there's a lot of risk. And I think, having the financing come after the project is turnkey and ready, that the financing comes after that fact, I think that would have been one of the biggest and the most important things for the First Nation to be successful, because we cannot use our own source revenue to be a part of a project that, may not be successful or there's cost overruns. With that, I'd just like to pass it off to Sean and see if he'd like to add anything.
Thank you, Charlene. The only thing that I would add.
Hang on. Mr. Tucker, I think, had an intervention before that.
Just quickly, I'm just looking at the Coastal GasLink project, because that specifically, I think, was, as your words, was a catalyst for change on some of the financing models, and that's so important. And it is such an important asset for our planet. We know natural gas is better for the environment, the good jobs that flow from it. So anything that you can add specifically that we've learned on the Coastal GasLink project that you guys were associated with that we can take in other projects, this is what I'm really looking to hopefully answer.
Yeah, and open to either of you to answer. So.
Yep, Sean, I'll give you an opportunity.
Thanks, Charlene, and thank you for the question. Yeah, so. In addition to what Charlene had mentioned as well, I think there's a few specific lessons that we could learn from the CGL project, and now many of the other projects that have come following the Coastal GasLink. And so I think the first thing is capacity building is essential. At that time, and it's quite a bit different now because of the efforts that FNMPC and organizations like the one that Sheldon is running as well. Many Indigenous partners may lack the experience in large equity project finance deals that, in the case of CGL, may go to capital markets for financing. And so without that deep support, terms typically heavily favor the corporate side, the proponent side. One of the lessons from Coastal GasLink was really those First Nations working together, coming together to negotiate those terms, the kind of legal and financial advisory support that was assembled around that project, the phased involvement and the shared expertise. One of the things that FNMPC did at that time was a Capital Markets 101 to 401 series, not only for those members that were involved in CGL, but for all First Nations. Those resources are available online. Another part was structuring that deal to kind of reflect the real risks. And so historically, many of these projects have kind of had passive investments set aside to invest equity in the project. CGL was really a novel kind of true option that was negotiated with downside protection for those First Nations. Strong governance alignment between the 11 First Nations that were involved that we were representing. Mechanisms to kind of reduce the regulatory risk. Those are all, I think, lessons that we can take away from that deal. But just also want to reiterate as well that there have been several deals now that have occurred since then with new novel models that are emerging.
Just time for a short one.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. There's misconceptions out there that some Indigenous people are against natural gas projects. And how are you able to convince them or show them the data that it's better for the environment and some of the local benefit agreements that have flowed from that project? How did those conversations unfold?
Quick response.
Yes, so I'm the former chief of Fort Nelson First Nation. We have the biggest gas basin in North America. And I think it's just about building trust with industry and government and having real conversations at the ground level, especially with our hunters, our gatherers, and our elders and youth and members. I think that's really important, is just having that understanding and sharing our knowledge with other neighboring nations.
Thank you. Mr. Gay for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mrs. Gale and Mr. Fantozio, thank you very much for being with the committee today. And helping us learn from your experience and from the broad exposure that you have to multiple First Nation major projects participation. So in that spirit, I would really like to hear some of the key learnings from an equity model. Mr. Fantozio, you were talking about some of the recent projects that have different construct. If we had a magic wand, what would be templates for participation in the future? There's many different economic models. There's different level of maturity, risk-taking. So when we're talking joint venture, equity stake, royalty agreement, I actually would like to hear you talk, maybe Mr. Fantozio or Mrs. Gale, going forward. What should be the template or templates, plural? And if we don't have time to answer all those questions today, love to have your submission, because the government is really looking forward to having good ideas and good templates we can engage for major project in the future.
Thank you for the question. I want to reiterate something that Mr. Whitney mentioned in his testimony as well, which is capacity and the resources to participate meaningfully and to make informed decisions is integral to any of these types of deals, whether they're involved with jobs, procurement, benefit sharing, environmental stewardship, or ultimately equity investment. The ability to have the resources to make informed decisions is extremely important. The next thing that I would mention as well is that access to capital supports must be tailored to the economic and financial realities of these projects. What I would say about the loan guarantee programs that are out there, for instance, many of them have been designed for kind of traditional energy or linear infrastructure projects. Many of those projects fall within rate-regulated industries where risk can be contained novelly in a project finance structure. When it comes to critical minerals, for instance, the economic and financial realities of this sector is quite different, and therefore those tools will need to change, and the deals will need to change to adapt. And so, while I'm hesitant to say that there is a template, what I would say is when First Nations have the ability to make informed decisions, like anyone in these deals, those deals will come together in a faster and more legitimate manner. And then ensuring that there is no kind of one-size-fits-all approach for these deals, I think is the best thing that the federal government could do. What we're now seeing as First Nation ownership and economic participation in the natural resource sector is expanding is these deals are taking many different shapes. We've shifted, like I said, from passive investment, 5-10% equity investment post-construction, to seeing full ownership of projects, the three ventures that Charlene had mentioned. So just ensuring here that there are the resources available to make informed decisions, that will get us to the right outcomes on these deals. So capacity support is important, ensuring that the programs that are advanced federally aren't tailored to one specific outcome, that they're tailored to the kind of diverse opportunities that are out there in the natural resource sector. I think this will be the most important.
Thank you. Mrs. Gale, you actually mentioned the loan guarantee program not being substantial enough. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I thought that's what I heard. The government recently announced that we were increasing from $5 billion to $10 billion the pool for a loan guarantee. Is this enough? And if I understood you correctly, what adjustment should we make?
Yeah, just in the next 10 years, there's going to be major project development happening within our country. And I think that foreign investment can help Canada scale its critical mineral strategy, but only if it aligns with Indigenous values and our environmental standards and Canada's natural interests. I think the reality is that First Nations are now being approached directly by international investors seeking access to our lands and resources, often without significant transparency or due diligence. I think we need to develop those relationships, but we also need clear federal frameworks and resource processes to help our nations vet potential partners and assessing, their integrity, their financial capacity in alignment with our community values. But this target requires funding for legal, commercial capacity and transparent disclosure statements from foreign entities operating in Indigenous territories. And I think that Canada also must ensure that foreign investment strengthens our sovereignty and partnerships rather than reproducing the extractive relationship of the past. And I also think of the Canada Infrastructure Bank and how important it is to, really increase their mandate. Also with the Indigenous Loan Guarantee, it has a low-risk mandate geared to supporting operational or near-operational projects, and this mandate will need to change to support projects going forward.
Thank you.
Especially in the critical minerals projects.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ms. Gale. Thank you, Mr. Gay. Wrapping up this round, Monsieur Simard, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms. Gale, I just want to make sure that you can hear me, that the interpretation is working. Can you hear the interpreter? So you can hear me. Good. So I liked what you said about the fact that venture capital to become partners for critical mineral projects should be limited, because there's a project in Quebec of a corridor on critical minerals, and there's the alliance of the Cree Nation who would like, in part, to rehabilitate part of a railway. So I have a question to know how Indigenous communities can create a framework that allows them to be owners of infrastructures or even developers of infrastructure. I don't know if you've done this in the past or if you have a model to present, but it would be interesting for the committee, I believe, to receive this information, this kind of information from you.
But infrastructure must be co-designed with First Nations from the onset to serve both the economic and community purpose. There's roads, there's ports, there's power lines, there's digital networks that should be that need to be built, but not solely for industry. They also connect our communities. And I think that lower local costs of living, enable long-term regional development. This means that we need to design things in multi-use and have climate resiliency and regional integrated systems that are working together and provide value just beyond a single project. First Nations are also leading in this space, and they are equity partners already in transmission lines, renewable projects, and transportation corridors that are going to be very important for remote-like locations and southern markets. I think it's very interesting because First Nations are already talking about these issues in northern Canada, port to port to port. And it's very interesting to see, the ideas that are coming from these conversations and being invited into these spaces. Any infrastructure going forward is going to cross on Indigenous lands, and I think it's really important for our success as a country to ensure that these nations that are coming up with these ideas and want the ownership of these projects are well funded and supported.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. That's a very enlightening response. And I'd be even happier if you would understood the problem of infrastructures in the north that are supposed to provide multiple uses. What I would like to know more about is how Indigenous communities can become, in part, developers of those infrastructures. If you have any documentation on that, it would be very interesting for the committee. But for now, I will concede my time to my colleague Jonathan, who has a few questions to ask you. Thank you very much for your evidence.
Merci, Mario.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Rowe.
Thank you. Ms. Gale, I do have a question. Last week we had a witness encouraging the government to double down on development in southern Canada where infrastructure is already in place. But I know, like in Newfoundland, many of our small communities were able to receive infrastructure because of mining development in that region. And I see a quote from you, you say, what is common among First Nations across Canada is that there are many infrastructure deficits in our communities, on our lands and on our reserves. That includes deficits as water, sewer, broadband, housing, roads, community service, transmission lines, reliable clean energy sources, and even healthcare services. And it's certainly a mouthful. But right across there's infrastructure that needs to happen. Do you think that focusing on mines near Indigenous communities should be a priority for this government as it would jumpstart the implementation of necessary infrastructure in those regions?
I think the primary barrier is structural, not technical. Many First Nations are being asked to engage in complex, capital, extensive projects while still contending with the legacy effects of underinvestment in basic community infrastructure. I live in the north. I've seen mines be in operation for 50 years, and the roads to the community that's like neighboring the project are gravel and haven't been paved. So if a community does not have reliable drinking water, accessible health care, housing, or education, it's really unrealistic to expect them to dedicate sustained attention to building a project or even having capacity to evaluate multi-million-dollar mineral projects when you have many social issues at home that you're trying to address. So the foundation for participating begins with ensuring the quality of life, continued federal and provincial investment at the community level infrastructure, housing, broadband, energy, transportation, social services is critical. And these are not separate from economic development. They are the preconditions for it. Communities that have stable infrastructure and well-being can create a time, a space, and a capacity to discuss these projects. But I think it's really important to know that when you are part of a project and you can create your own source revenue, that you're able to build up your housing, you're able to build up your community, so that.
Alrighty, yeah. Time's up. I'm afraid. Thank you both, and we are going to move on to our final round. That's going to take us past the top of the hour, colleagues. But let's go. Mr. Mallett, followed by MP Hogan, Monsieur Simard. 5 minutes for MP Mallett and Hogan, 2.5 for Monsieur Simard.
Thank you. Madame Gale, question for you. Could you describe, is this on? Yes, could you describe your experience with the assessment process for critical minerals and mining projects and how it has been beneficial to Indigenous stakeholders, as well as some of the changes that you would recommend being made to ensure efficiency, transparency within the approval system?
Okay, I would like to pass this on to Sean.
Thank you, Charlene. And thank you for the question. What I would say kind of generally about the impact assessment process and And I'll preface this by saying FNMPC has recently published 2 reports on the value of phase 0 engagement, which we're calling kind of pre-engagement in these processes, and capacity all throughout. Both of those things are very important. So, capacity is the foundation that allows First Nations to engage on a level playing field with both industry and government. So it means having that access to full range of expertise, legal, financial, and technical. It means having access to the in-house professionals. But it also means the ability to engage citizens, their own First Nations own citizens, through meetings, language translation, transparent access to project data, like Mr. Whitney was mentioning earlier. These are things that transform these engagement and consultation processes into meaningful participation, and ultimately transforming participation into consent. And so, we could probably spend too much time talking about this issue, but I think the most important element for these impact assessment processes and permitting processes are early engagement that are sufficiently resourced for First Nations. We'll only move at the pace of trust here.
On the same subject, since the Impact Assessment Act, known as Bill C-69, has there been projects that have influenced Indigenous-led projects and has contributed positively to furthering the Indigenous economic development? And what more could the government do to ensure that Indigenous projects are not stuck in regulatory delays?
Happy to take this one as well. Several projects are now being advanced with not only with Indigenous participation, but with Indigenous leadership. Many, inside and outside of federal and provincial impact assessment processes, there are projects that are successfully moving forward that are Indigenous owned or have significant Indigenous involvement. Again, one of the biggest components here is having the capacity to advance these projects and to make informed decisions. Having the technical expertise and the trust and relationships to advance joint ventures. Those are, I think those are kind of the key components here. Ultimately, First Nations want to exercise the right to self-determination and to advance projects on their lands, in their waters, with their resources. And so, finding ways to kind of ensure that these projects are given the resources and given the attention. Those are what leads to the success here in the impact assessment processes.
Thank you. We have one more minute. Could you give us an example of a success story of a project that has been extremely successful?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. I mean, I think perhaps one of the most prevalent examples at this moment is the Cedar LNG project in British Columbia, and also the Woodfibre project. Both of these projects had extensive involvement from the First Nation government and the First Nation community. For Cedar LNG, for instance, the environmental team for Haisla Nation was an in-house team with a member from Haisla that worked extensively with the community. There were referendums within the community all throughout the process, outside of the community as well, where Haisla members were living, off reserve or outside of Haisla territory. And that project was successfully assessed and permitted on a very decent timeline. The next example with Woodfibre LNG, same thing. Squamish Nation undertook its own Indigenous-led assessment concurrently with the federal and provincial governments.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Hogan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Ms. Gale, in your opening remarks, you mentioned a changing landscape, and you said that more than 500 impact benefit agreements have been signed. Many more have endured environmental damage and little to no lasting benefits. And as I've heard from all of you, as we've heard from all of you, engaging at the ground floor, supporting capacity to assess projects, a huge part of it, but I also suspect there's more. So it doesn't need to be specific projects, but I'm wondering, to help fill out the picture for the committee, if you can give characteristics of good agreements that provide the kind of long-term benefit you've discussed and characteristics of bad agreements that provide little to no lasting benefit.
Okay, so as a chief, I had to deal with a lot of negotiations. And, you know, I think that success means that Canada, where First Nations are more than parties with whom the Crown or the project component engage or consult, it needs to be based on relationship building, where First Nations are the economic partners and environmental stewardships. 10 years ago, that wasn't the case, and I think things are changing for the better, and we're having those discussions. But I think success looks more like Indigenous integration in any project and into the supply chain and meeting that full value. First Nations, you know, owning the mines and the infrastructure that comes with it, and that First Nations will have the ability to supply and service these mine sites, and also having our people working at these sites, not just on the ground, but through the ownership at the board level and the management level. There's so much that we look forward to in owning these projects. And in my community, we're going to be 100% owner of a geothermal facility. And our people are really excited about that opportunity and what's going to bring to the local economy and the relationship it's going to build with our treaty partners.
And examples of maybe characteristics of deals where there is not lasting benefit? Like, is there areas we should be very careful to avoid or very careful to encourage the structuring of agreements of a certain type?
I think just when industry comes in or government comes in, that, you know, the First Nation government looks after the rights and title, and the corporation of the nation looks after the deal in what can be done. I think both are two important pieces, because, you know, through the negotiations of the chief and council, you can really do some things for your community and move beyond just payments and towards partnership. You know, I've seen when oil and gas came into our territory, you know, they said no and impact benefit agreements, no equity, and it left us at a standstill. And so what happened is the only place where we had a right to say anything is at the gas plant, because all of the permits were piecemealed up to that point. And there was a lot of court cases, and, you know, there's been a lot of court cases across Canada, and we were successful in winning those court cases. So, you know, fast forward into this new, you know, way of doing business, I think that we're seeing a lot of successes, but a lot of things need to be improved on the government level, especially where there's shared decision-making in policy and in incorporating our Indigenous values and our laws into those processes so that we all can be successful.
Chair informs me I've got 1 minute left, so I did want to quickly ask about economic participation, which builds on many of the questions today. Witnesses at this and previous committees have talked about the ability to consider different financial structures. Mr. Fentoso, you touched on this. Can you expand on different models of Indigenous participation very briefly now and maybe in a written submission after?
Yes, happy to respond to this question, and we'll just quickly reiterate what I mentioned before. Equity investment, you know, today is looked at as a bit of a panacea, but especially when looking at the critical mineral sector, specifically employment, procurement, business supply, lasting benefit sharing. These are all components of economic participation. There's not only one model, is what I would say. So we're seeing an emergence of different elements of Indigenous economic participation in these projects, and some First Nations will value different routes.
Thank you. Monsieur Simard, 2.5 minutes, followed by Mr. Martel and MP Danko.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have to say, Ms. Gill, and same thing for Mr. Whitney earlier, I find it fascinating how at this time the First Nations have become investors, people who can raise capital like other investors. And I'm wondering, I'm going to talk about the Quebec model. There's a model in Quebec that's that of the workers' funds. So these, and also regional development funds. So 6 months before I do my income tax, I decide to invest in the workers' funds. I will receive a fiscal benefit if I do that, or if I do this before doing my income tax. And so often workers are invited to invest in mining projects and natural resource projects. But I don't know for you. Mr. Whitney gave us the example earlier of royalties that they were receiving. I don't know for you if there are factors that encourage you to raise this kind of capital. If that were the case, it would help if First Nations were encouraged to become developers of infrastructure. You should have ways of being encouraged. Is it possible to do that now? Have you already thought of this?
Chief, we got many investments. We got monies from different agreements. And so what we did is we decided to invest in the stocks. And so we have seen growth over our bank accounts over the last decade that have added tremendous value to be able to build up our own communities. But at the same time, when you have that kind of money and you're getting into a project for the first time, you don't want to take that risk and use your money, especially when you have 7 generations to care for. So I just, I think that's really important, but I'm really thankful for the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program and the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, because those give us the tools to be able to be involved in these projects meaningfully and financially. But what I think that you'll see is that once these tools are utilized, we've seen it, like you said, in Quebec with the First Nation. They needed the support to get the initial funding to get stage 1 of the project done. And, they've been in operation for several years now. Tremendous community investment, infrastructure building happening. And also through their own source revenue, they're able to fund the second phase of the project without having to go back to the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program or any other financial vehicle, because they're able to do it with their own funds.
Thank you. So last 2 speakers, MP Martel and MP Danko, each for 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je vais partager mon temps.
Thank you very much, Chair. I will share my time with my colleague Jonathan here. So, Mr. Whitney, in terms of decision-making and unanimity, I have a question. Does each development project on Indigenous territory should receive the unanimous approval of all communities that are affected in order to go forward?
For the question. I think it's a bit of a complex question, but I'll try and be very quick. I think that the intention and practice should be to achieve consent from as many nations as possible, if not all, if that is possible. Many times projects do get approved when nations intervene, and I think one of the difficult things is that what we find is oftentimes industry can choose winners and choose losers. And so if there are nations that perhaps don't support a project, they may or may not get as much attention as those that do. And that leads to benefits. I think that Canada and the respective provinces have a big role to play. I think that Ms. Gail had mentioned it a bit earlier, but those legislative and regulatory regimes play into that decision making firsthand. And so the shared decision making model as it moves forward becomes increasingly important when it comes to unanimity, as you mentioned, with respect to supporting projects. That shared decision making, and I think it's very important to understand that there's relationships with proponents, there's relationships with regulators, and there's Crown relationships as well that First Nations are navigating all at the same time. And they're trying to figure opportunities where who's going to hold companies accountable and who's going to enforce legislation and regulatory aspects. So these are all part of a complex picture that we continuously navigate when it comes to considering projects in our lands. But that shared decision-making model as we move forward to achieve consent, it's extremely important, because we live it every day and we see projects where after the fact, when equity opportunities are presented, that those that support the project, they will get that opportunity to become owners in projects at the expense of some other nations that do not get that same opportunity, which is very problematic. I think that's something very important for the committee to be mindful of as your discussions move forward.
Excusez, je vais le garder, oui. OK, je ne partagerai plus mon temps parce que...
I'm no longer going to be sharing my time because it's taking longer than I anticipated. Mr. Whitney. Sorry, I'll continue. How can one find a balance between respecting Indigenous rights and the necessity of avoiding that projects be blocked for years and years?
I think, I'll refer really to Ms. Gale and some of her comments. I mean, we've talked a lot about meaningful engagement and consultation. The value that a project brings to enhance local First Nations infrastructure is very important. Again, I'll go back to some of my earlier points. Concepts and notions around resource revenue sharing and royalty sharing, that's extremely important. And just to one of the previous speakers about the Quebec Fund, perhaps that's an opportunity to utilize some of that resource royalty to be put forward into a fund for future First Nations investment in respective provinces. I mean, that's a great opportunity, I believe, here in Saskatchewan. I think that the benefits from projects, as we look forward to consent and perhaps not blocking a project, it's going to take some very important work and serious considerations on behalf of the proponents and on behalf of the respective governments in terms of how legislative and regulatory regimes are developed. But that free, prior, informed consent is always in our minds, and how do we look to achieve that? And so when we're talking about funding, we're talking about capacity, we're talking about meaningful inclusion. Those are all very important aspects that will really be at the perspective of the nations. But that's a big journey ahead for the proponents and the government too.
Thank you, Mr. Martel. Mr. Whitney, we're going on to our last questioner, MP Danko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to pick up on the point that Mr. Martel was questioning as well. My experience, my perspective is Southern Ontario, where often the elected band councils are seen as a colonial construct, where you have various iterations or groups of hereditary chiefs, some self-appointed development groups, multiple First Nations that can have a stake in the same projects, and they all have these myriad of different organizations and groups that all have some sort of stake also in that project. And from a government perspective, it can be, really frustrating when you think that you have a constructive, collaborative approach. You move forward with a project, and then, as Mr. Martel was getting at, there's a protest, or it's frustrated when you get to site. So understanding that you're working with the First Nations Major Projects Coalition and also in Saskatchewan with multiple First Nations involved, how do you see these overarching coalitions fitting into helping move these projects forward and working collaboratively in a more constructive relationship with First Nations?
Okay, so this is one of those situations where, you have different First Nations and they have different laws, different languages, different values. And so the Indigenous governance can be really complicated at times, including by colonization. Typical band governments, they are on reserve, and hereditary chiefs are in the traditional territories. So it's really important to have conversations and build trust with both leaders and members. But for the First Nation Major Projects Coalition, we're not project specific. We do not, propose projects to our members. Our members are the ones that come to us and ask for the capacity support. So I think that's very important to understand. But at times, yes, it can be very complicated and complex based on, the different nations and what their needs are and, how they want to engage in the consultation process.
Thank you. And just with whatever time I have remaining, I think this is the end here. So I wanted to give the three of you an opportunity to offer any closing remarks that you wanted to share with the group.
Great idea.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This kind of goes into the question that I had from another member here, but our research shows that, there's going to be more than 500 natural resource projects that will be built in Canada over the next decade. And as I said, these projects will be built on Indigenous lands, and these projects represent over $630 billion in capital investment. Using our internal calculations and estimates, we project that $50 billion of that could represent First Nation equity investment that will need to be financed. And that's just an investment. This doesn't include any of the procurement and the employment and other First Nation businesses opportunities that will want to be involved through our membership. And these projects will generate billions in economic benefit for First Nations in the form of revenue sharing, impact benefit agreements, jobs and procurement and training, which is really, really important for the Canadian economy. But also, I just wanted to say that Indigenous partnership is not a barrier. It is Canada's strategic advantage that needs to be nurtured and supported through real investment in capacity. Mr. Watney talked about this. And I think that every successful project in the next decade will really depend on it. When Indigenous rights and ownership are embedded from the beginning, projects will move faster, you'll face fewer disputes, and you'll generate shared prosperity for all Canadians.
Yeah. Maybe, Mr. Watney, a last word from you, and then we will have to adjourn.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Very quickly, thank you very much for your comments, Ms. Gale, and I'd certainly echo her comments. One of the things that I would like to just continue to encourage is for the members to really consider what type of strategic priorities there are in terms of government available programs for First Nations to better participate in intergovernmental processes for one, but also as owners in major projects. I think that capacity funding, whether it's a ICSP with the Impact Assessment Agency or INRP with NRCan, those are important pots of funding for organizations and for First Nations to be able to access, especially as Bill C-5 comes forward. The Major Projects Office is structured and implemented and deployed. But just remember, we also have our work that is ongoing for organizations like FNMPC and the Center to do work on behalf of our nations at the direction of our nations, which is very important. We're mandated organizations that do very important work. So I'll leave my comments there. I think that's an important one.
Well, thank you to all of our witnesses this morning, this afternoon. Very rich testimony providing very important First Nations perspectives, which is an important part of the motion that we passed, and that guides our study. We will be having other Indigenous witnesses, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and this has been very, very important for us to hear today. So thank you so much, and thank you to my colleagues for great questions, good focused questions, and a very productive session. And may I wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving, connecting with your families and your communities. We'll see you back here on the 20th.
Thank you.